Months ago, my son stood in the middle of my watch repair shop and shouted in my face, "You can't afford to raise your own granddaughter anymore. Either hand over the trust fund or get ready to lose everything." He thought I was just a lonely old man surrounded by the ticking of old clocks, easy to corner and easier to break. But he didn't know the antique clock inside my house had quietly recorded every secret he tried to bury. And when it finally chimed, his whole life began to collapse on its own. I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I read every single one. A small note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for educational and entertainment purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but everything it asks you to feel is entirely intentional. The last quiet morning. Some mornings my watch shop looks more like a painting than a place where actual work gets done. The Oregon fog sits thick against the front windows. The amber lamp throws soft light across the old wooden counter, and the smell of clock oil mixed with damp wood creates something I've never found the right word for, only that whenever I breathe it in, I know I'm exactly where I belong. That morning, Nora was sitting at the corner workbench, with a loop strapped to her forehead, carefully disassembling the movement of an antique pocket watch a customer had dropped off the week before. She was 15 small for her age, dark hair pulled back tight so it wouldn't fall across her eyes while she worked. Her hands moved between the gears with a precision that had taken me nearly 20 years to develop, and she had learned it in fewer than 3. I sat at the bench across from her pretending to review the order book, but really just watching her work. It was a habit I'd had for a long time without admitting it. Watching Nora work was like checking to make sure the world was still running correctly. "Podintas. The mainspring is partially fractured," she said without looking up. "Not completely broken, which is why it kept running, but it's been keeping wrong time. The customer thinks it's a battery problem." "I know," I said. "This is a mechanical watch. There is no battery." "I know that too." She looked up at me through the loop, that flat, steady look she had when she knew she was being tested. Then she went back to work without another word. That was how Nora accepted a compliment. Silence, and then she kept going. 5 years. I had been raising Nora for 5 years in this small shop on the Oregon coast, and I still sometimes found myself surprised by the way she filled a room without taking up much space. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand things. She never complained about growing up in a watch repair shop instead of a normal house with a backyard and neighborhood friends. She observed, she learned, she worked moving at her own pace, which I had gradually come to understand was the only pace in this shop that kept perfect time. Nora's cataplexy. A neurological condition that causes sudden involuntary muscle weakness, triggered by strong emotion, which could cause her body to buckle without warning when she felt too much joy, too much fear, or too much surprise, had never touched her mind. Her brain remained sharp in a way that still caught me off guard sometimes. Only her body occasionally failed to keep up. I was thinking about that when the door chime rang. Nora set her tools down immediately. Not slowly, not with hesitation. She unclipped the loop from her forehead, stood and walked straight into the back room, with steps so quiet I barely heard them. The entire thing took fewer than 5 seconds before the front door had fully opened. I didn't have time to ask why before I saw who was standing in the doorway. Dennis Greer. My son stepped inside, wearing the smile I recognized from when he was a boy. That smile had once made me believe everything was fine. Now looking at it for the first time in 5 years, I noticed what I had always failed to see. It never reached his eyes. Dennis looked older than I remembered at 42. Gray had come in at both temples, and his face carried new lines that I didn't think came from sun or wind. He wore a good coat and polished shoes, But there was something in the way he held his shoulders, slightly too rigid to be natural, that told me the exterior was working hard to hold together. Standing just behind him was a woman I had never seen before. Dark hair cut cleanly at the jaw, a charcoal blazer, a small leather bag held in her left hand. Her eyes made a quick pass around the shop, across the glass display cases, up to the wall of clocks, pausing at the door, leading to the back room before they settled on me. It was not the look of someone visiting a family home. It was the look of someone calculating the value of what was in front of them. Dennis said, his voice warm in a way that sounded well-rehearsed. It's been a long time. I stood up from my stool. My hands trembled slightly, not from emotion, but because 70 years and 5 decades of working with small instruments had left their mark on my nerves in ways that couldn't be undone. I had learned to live with the trembling hands. I had not yet learned to live with the man standing in front of me. Dennis, I said, just his name, nothing else. He stepped further inside and looked around the shop with a performed kind of nostalgia. Still exactly the same. You still have that big wall clock. It still runs. Good, good. He turned back to me, then gestured to the woman beside him. This is Sylvia Marsh, my wife. She's an attorney. Her practice is based in New York. Sylvia Marsh stepped forward and extended her hand. The handshake was firm enough to be professional, brief enough to be controlled, the handshake of someone who managed every small gesture deliberately. Hello, Mr. Greer. Dennis has told me a great deal about you. He hasn't told me anything about you, I said honestly. Something moved behind her eyes, not embarrassment, closer to calculation. Then she smiled. We kept things quiet. Dennis wanted to keep it private. Dennis looked around the shop once more, and his gaze stopped at the door to the back room where Nora had just disappeared. Where's Nora, Dad? I heard she's been doing some interesting things. I looked at my son directly. She's studying. Here. A surprised look that wasn't quite natural. I thought she'd be at a regular school. She learns in her own way, I said. She always has. Dennis nodded slowly, the smile still in place. But his eyes moved one more time toward the back room door, and this time I was certain. That was not the look of a father who had missed his daughter for 5 years. That was the look of a man searching for something specific. The ticking of dozens of clocks on the walls filled the silence between us. And in that moment, I understood something I did not want to understand. This visit was not about repairing anything. This was reconnaissance. The envelope from New York. 3 days after Dennis's visit, the shop settled back into its usual rhythm, or at least it looked that way from the outside. The clocks ticked, the fog came and went, and I opened the display cases each morning the same way I had for 40 years. But I noticed that I had started sleeping lighter, that I was listening for the door chime more than I used to, that I no longer sat with my back to the window. Nora was at her Tuesday afternoon tutoring session when the mail carrier knocked. I was alone at the workbench fitting a replacement crown gear into a lady's wristwatch when I heard the knock at the front door. The mail carrier handed me a large envelope without much ceremony, thick cream-colored with a return address from a law firm in Manhattan that took up 3 full lines of print. I set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment before opening it. The language inside was dense and deliberate, the kind of writing designed to exhaust the reader before they reached the part that actually mattered. I read it slowly, moving my finger under each line, the way my father had taught me to read anything important. It took me 2 full passes to be certain I understood correctly. Dennis was filing a petition with the Oregon Family Court to be appointed Nora's financial guardian. The stated grounds were that Nora, as a minor under 18 with a diagnosed neurological condition, lacked the legal capacity to manage assets of significant value. The assets in question were listed precisely $5 million derived from the sale of a medical device patent 8 months prior. I put the papers down on the counter and stood very still. $5 million. The number wasn't what stopped me. I already knew what Nora's patent had sold for. What stopped me was the phrase the attorneys had chosen neurological condition, rendering the minor unable to exercise sound financial judgment. They were using her cataplexy, a condition that affected her muscles, not her mind. A condition that had nothing to do with how she thought or reasoned or made decisions. They had taken the one thing about Nora that was genuinely fragile and built a legal argument on top of it. I was still standing at the counter when I heard the back door open. Nora came in from the side entrance she always used when returning from tutoring, dropping her bag on the chair by the door out of habit. She was halfway to the kitchen before she saw my face. She stopped walking. She looked at the envelope on the counter, then at me, then back at the envelope. "They sent it already," she said. It wasn't a question. You knew this was coming. She crossed the room, pulled out the stool across from me and sat down. From her bag, she removed a thin manila folder and placed it on the counter between us. She did it carefully, the way she handled small components at the workbench, deliberate, no-wasted movement. "I've known something like this was coming for 2 years," she said. I didn't know exactly when. I opened the folder. Inside were documents I recognized immediately, a trust agreement properly formatted, bearing my own signature on the last page. A trust I had signed 8 months ago before any of this had started. I remembered the afternoon she had brought me the papers, explaining that it was a protective structure for the patent proceeds. I had read the summary she prepared, asked a few questions, and signed where she indicated. I had trusted her judgment the way I always did. In the United States, a trust is a legal arrangement where one party, called the trustee, holds and manages assets on behalf of another, called the beneficiary. Because Nora was a minor, she could not legally enter into financial contracts on her own, but as her court-appointed guardian, I could act on her behalf. What I hadn't fully understood until this moment was how precisely she had used that arrangement. Dr. Turcombe. "I set up the trust through a Portland attorney 8 months ago," Nora said. "I asked you to sign as my guardian because I'm not old enough to execute the documents myself. The trust protects the patent proceeds from any third-party claim, including a guardianship petition. If a court appoints a financial guardian for me, they manage my personal finances, but they cannot touch assets that are already held inside a properly structured trust." I looked at my signature on the last page. "You planned this before Dennis even contacted us. I found his bankruptcy filings on Pacer when I was 13. She said it the way she described mechanical problems, factual, no particular emotion, attached to the words themselves. Pacer is the federal court's public access system. Anyone in the United States can search it. He had been through 2 Chapter 7 liquidations in 4 years. I started monitoring his financial activity after that. When the patent sold, I knew it was only a matter of time. You were 13 years old. I was worried about you," she said simply. "You wouldn't have fought this on your own. You would have tried to find a way to keep the peace." I didn't answer because she was right. I looked at her hands resting flat on the counter. Small hands, steady, the same hands that had taken apart a broken pocket watch that morning, with more skill than most trained watchmakers I had known. The same hands that had apparently been building a legal defense for 2 years without telling me. I thought about Claire then. Nora's mother. The woman who had brought this child to my door on a rainy night 5 years ago, with a look in her eyes that I had chosen for 5 years not to examine too closely. A week after she left Nora with me, she was dead, a car accident on a wet road outside Portland. No witnesses, case closed. I had accepted that. I had told myself it was the only thing I could do. Now, sitting across from my 15-year-old granddaughter, who had been quietly preparing for this moment since she was 13, I felt the question I had buried start to surface again. Claire had been afraid of something specific the night she came to my door. Not just afraid running. Nora, I said. Yes. I looked at the trust documents, then at her. We'll talk more tonight. But first, are there other things you haven't told me? She held my gaze for a moment. Yes, she said. But one thing at a time, Grandpa. The night she came in the rain. After Nora went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and the trust documents spread out in front of me that I wasn't really reading anymore. The lamp above the table made a small circle of yellow light. Outside, the Pacific pushed against the rocks the way it always did at night, steady and different, older than anything either of us was dealing with. I had told Nora we would talk more, but sitting alone in the kitchen, I found that the conversation I needed to have wasn't with her. It was with myself. Specifically with the version of myself that had spent 5 years choosing not to ask certain questions. The memory came back the way it always did, when I let my guard down, not gradually, but all at once, like a clock that had been wound too tight, finally releasing. It was March of 2020, nearly midnight. I had been asleep for 2 hours when the knocking started at the front door of the shop. Not the bell, but knocking the kind that meant someone was using their fist. I came downstairs in my robe with a flashlight, irritated, already composing the words I was going to say to whoever thought this was an appropriate hour. I opened the door and stopped composing anything. Claire Greer, my daughter-in-law, Dennis's wife, a woman I had met perhaps a dozen times over the years at holidays and the occasional dinner, was standing in the rain without an umbrella. She was holding a small, rolling suitcase in one hand and the hand of a 10-year-old girl in the other. The girl was Nora. She was wearing a raincoat 2 sizes too large, her dark eyes wide open and very still, watching me the way children watch adults when they are trying to determine whether the adult can be trusted. Claire looked like she had been driving for a long time. Her hair was soaked flat against her face, and there was a tightness around her mouth that I recognized as the expression of someone who had been holding themselves together through force of will for longer than was sustainable. Please, she said. Just that word first. Then, I need you to take her. Please keep her here and don't tell Dennis where she is. I stepped back and let them both inside. I put Nora on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water and told her she was safe, which felt both true and insufficient. Then I walked Claire into the kitchen and closed the door. What happened? I asked. She shook her head, not refusing to answer, more like she was deciding how much to say. She set her keys on the table. Her hands were not steady. I can't explain everything tonight, she said. There isn't time and I need to get back before he realizes I'm gone. She looked up at me. I just need to know she'll be safe here. With you. Of course she will, I said. But Claire, she's better with you than with either of us, she said. She always has been. She's more like you than she is like Dennis. More like you than she is like me. She almost smiled when she said it, a tired, genuine smile that didn't belong in that kitchen at that hour. You'll see what I mean. I walked her back to the front door. She crouched down and held Nora for a long moment, said something quietly into her hair that I couldn't hear. Then she stood up, picked up her keys, and looked at me one last time. That was when I saw it. She shifted her coat to reach for the door handle, and the collar pulled back just enough. A bruise along the side of her neck faded to yellow-green at the edges, which meant it was several days old. She saw me see it. She didn't explain it. She pulled the collar back into place, opened the door, and walked out into the rain. 1 week later, the Portland Police Department called me. Claire had been found at the bottom of a ravine off Highway 30, still in her car. The road had been wet. There were no skid marks. The investigating officer told me these things in a flat, professional voice. and I listened and said thank you. And after I hung up, I sat in the same kitchen chair I was sitting in now and stared at the wall for a long time. I had told myself it was an accident. I had told myself this consistently with discipline for 5 years. I told myself the bruise could have been from anything. I told myself that Claire's fear that night was the fear of a difficult marriage, not the fear of something worse. I told myself that people die in car accidents on wet roads, and that sometimes there are no skid marks because there is no time to break, and that the absence of an explanation is not the same as the presence of something sinister. I had been very thorough about telling myself these things. Now, sitting in the same chair with the trust documents on the table and Nora asleep in the next room. Nora, who had been quietly preparing legal defenses since she was 13, who moved through the world like someone who understood from a very early age that danger was real. And preparation was the only answer I found that I could no longer make myself believe the story I had been telling. Claire had been afraid of Dennis specifically. She had said, "Don't tell Dennis." Not "don't tell anyone." Dennis. She had brought Nora to me because she believed I was the safest option available. And 1 week later, she was dead on a road with no witnesses and no skid marks. I sat with that for a long time in the yellow lamplight, while the ocean pushed against the rocks outside. I had spent 5 years not asking the question. I understood now that the question had always been there waiting the way a fracture waits inside a mainspring invisible until the mechanism finally fails. I hadn't wanted to see it. That was the truth I owed myself at 70 years old in a kitchen that smelled like clock oil and old wood. I picked up my tea. It was completely cold. I drank it anyway. The answer, if there was one, wasn't something I was going to find sitting still. The old detective and the gray suit. I opened the shop an hour earlier than usual the next morning. There was no particular reason to no appointments, no urgent repairs waiting. I simply could not sit in the kitchen any longer, and the workbench was the one place where my hands had something useful to do, even when my head did not. I had been grinding down a replacement pivot for a mantel clock for about 40 minutes, when I heard the familiar sound of the front step creaking under a specific weight. Some sounds you learn over decades without meaning to. That particular creak belonged to one person. Rex Holden pushed the door open with his shoulder, the way he always did, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner 3 blocks down. He was 65, broad through the chest, in a way that hadn't diminished much with age, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried movements of a man who had spent 30 years as a criminal investigator and had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. He had retired from the Oregon State Police 4 years ago and now lived 6 blocks from my shop, which meant he stopped by roughly once a month to drink coffee and say very little in a companionable way. He set one of the cups on my workbench without asking if I wanted it. "And you're here early," he said. "Huh, so are you." He pulled the stool out from under the counter and sat down. He looked at the legal envelope still sitting at the end of the bench. I hadn't moved it, and he did not pretend to be surprised by it. "I heard Dennis was back in town," he said. I looked at him. "From who?" "Frank DeLuca. He works financial crimes out of the Portland field office now. We came up together in the 90s. Rex wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Frank mentioned Dennis Greer's name about 8 months ago in passing, the way you mention something you think might matter to someone you know. I've been paying attention since then." Paying attention how? Rex was quiet for a moment. He had a way of pausing before he said things that mattered not for effect, but because he actually thought before he spoke, which I had come to understand was rarer than it should be. "Public records mostly. Court filings. Some conversations with people who owe me favors." He looked at me steadily. "Your son is in serious financial trouble, Walter. The kind that doesn't get better on its own." He reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the workbench beside my coffee. The name on it was a deputy district attorney for Multnomah County. "You don't need to call today, but keep it." I picked up the card and held it. What exactly do you think is going to happen? I think, Rex said carefully, that Dennis came here because he needs money and he's run out of other options. And I think Sylvia Marsh did not marry him for love. He stood up, finished his coffee in 2 long swallows, and set the cup down. There's something else I've been looking at. I'm not ready to talk about it yet. But I want you to know I'm looking. He left without explaining further. That was also something I had come to expect from Rex. He told you exactly as much as he had confirmed, and not one word more. I thought about what he said for the rest of the morning. 2 days later, Sylvia Marsh came to the shop alone. There was no phone call ahead of time, no appointment. She simply appeared at the door at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, while Nora was at her tutoring session, and I was alone behind the counter. She was dressed the same way she had been the first time, controlled, precise, nothing out of place. She came in and looked around the shop once with the same appraising eyes, then settled them on me with what I recognized as a professionally calibrated expression of concern. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to speak with you privately, if that's all right." I gestured to the chair across the counter. She sat, crossed her ankles, and placed a manila folder on the glass between us. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "Dennis and I are both worried about Nora. Not about who she is or what she's capable of. She's clearly a remarkable young woman. But the practical reality is that a 15-year-old with a neurological condition managing assets of this size without professional guidance, that's a situation that could go wrong in ways that would be very difficult to correct later." She opened the folder and turned it to face me. "This is a medical and financial support application. It would allow Dennis to provide structured oversight of Nora's trust with full transparency and court supervision. It's designed to protect her, not to restrict her." I pulled the folder toward me and read through the first 2 pages slowly. My father had taught me to always read the part they don't summarize for you. By the 3rd page, I understood what I was actually looking at. In American law, a power of attorney is a legal document that grants one person the authority to act on behalf of another in financial or legal matters. What Sylvia had presented as a support application was in its operative clauses a broad financial power of attorney that would give Dennis effective control over the management of Nora's trust, with language vague enough to be interpreted very widely by any attorney willing to argue it. It was not a support document. It was a transfer of control dressed in the language of care. I looked up from the papers. "I'll need some time to read through this properly," I said. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." Sylvia smiled the same smile she had used on my front step 3 days ago. Practiced, patient, not quite warm. "Of course. Take all the time you need." She left the folder on the counter when she stood to go. At the door, she paused. "I do hope we can resolve this without it becoming adversarial, Mr. Greer. That wouldn't be good for anyone, especially not for Nora." I watched her walk back to her car through the front window. Then I stood very still at the counter for a moment, looking at the folder she had left behind. The back door opened. Nora came in from her tutoring session, dropped her bag, and stopped when she saw my face. "She was here," Nora said. "Just left." Nora looked at the folder on the counter. Then she looked at me with an expression I was starting to recognize, not worry, but alertness. The look of someone whose calculations had just been confirmed. "She sent me something too," she said, pulling out her phone. "A new phone, gift delivery. It arrived at the tutoring center an hour ago." Jacques Dutrieu, "What the enemy sends you." The phone was still in its box on the kitchen table when I came in from locking up the shop. Nora was sitting in front of her laptop with a cable running from the USB port to the box itself. She had connected the device without powering it, on which was not how most 15-year-olds received a gift. "You haven't opened it," I said. "Did I open the box?" she said. "I haven't turned it on." She was watching a window on her laptop screen that showed a scrolling column of data I didn't recognize. "Give me about 10 more minutes." I put the kettle on and sat down across from her. Through the window above the sink, I could hear the ocean but not see it, just darkness and the sound of water moving against rock. I watched her work and tried to follow what she was doing. Nora explained it to me later, after she had finished, in the patient and precise way she always explained technical things, starting from what I already understood and building outward from there. When a phone is manufactured, it runs on software called firmware, which controls the basic operations of the device before any apps are installed. It is possible, she told me, to embed a monitoring application inside that firmware layer deeper than the visible software, in a place most users would never look and most standard security scans would not catch. The application she had found was designed to periodically transmit the device's location and screen content to an external server. To anyone who didn't know to look for it, the phone would appear completely normal. She had found it by connecting the unpowered device to her laptop and analyzing what data packets it attempted to send the moment it received power through the cable. It had tried to make 3 outbound connections before she cut the signal. "So she wanted to track you," I said. She wanted to know where I was, what I was looking at, and possibly what I was typing." Nora closed the laptop halfway, which is useful information to have if you're building a legal case and you want to know whether the other side is preparing anything. "What are you going to do with it?" Nora looked at the phone for a moment. Then she looked at me, and something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. I had seen that expression perhaps 4 or 5 times in 5 years. It meant she had already decided. "I'm going to use it," she said. "Turned on, connected, behaving exactly like a normal phone. I'll send messages that I want her to see. I'll let her think she knows what I know." She picked up the box and set it aside. The most useful thing an opponent can give you is the belief that they're in control of the information. I thought about that for a while. Then I said, "Where did you learn to think like that?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions. "I learned it from watching you work," she said finally. "You always said the most important part of repairing a watch isn't fixing what's broken. It's understanding why it broke and what it was trying to do when it failed." That sent me somewhere else back 3 years, to a night I hadn't thought about in a while, but which, sitting in that kitchen, felt suddenly close. Nora had been 12. It was late past 10, which was past her usual hour, but she had been quiet enough in the workroom that I hadn't noticed until I came to lock up and found her still at the small desk in the corner, with the lamp pulled low over a piece of drafting paper. She was drawing something, not a picture, a diagram. Rows of small interlocking shapes connected by lines annotated in handwriting too small for me to read from the doorway. I came closer. It was a circuit diagram of some kind, but embedded within it were what appeared to be mechanical components. Tiny springs and levers rendered with the same precision she used when she drew gear assemblies for practice. "What is this?" I asked. "Oh, a sensor," she said. "For detecting irregular heartbeats. If the mechanical element is small enough, it can be integrated directly into a wearable device, something a person would actually wear, not carry." She pointed to a cluster of small shapes at the center of the diagram. "This part is the problem. I can design the sensing mechanism, but I don't know how to make it small enough to be practical. The components I need don't exist in the sizes I need them." I pulled up a stool and looked at the diagram more carefully. She was right that the components didn't exist off the shelf. But the problem she was describing, miniaturizing a mechanical movement to function reliably at very small tolerances, was something I had spent a significant portion of my working life thinking about. "How small?" I asked. 2 millimeters, maybe less." I was quiet for a moment. Then I went to the cabinet where I kept my reference materials and pulled out a folder of technical drawings from a restoration project I had done years earlier, a complicated minute repeater, the kind of watch that chimes the time on demand, which requires extraordinarily delicate internal mechanisms. I spread the drawings on the desk next to her diagram. This is how they solved a similar problem in 1961, I said. The principle still works. The materials are better now. She looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. Then she picked up her pencil and began to revise her diagram, incorporating elements from the technical drawings with modifications I wouldn't have thought of. We worked together at that desk until nearly midnight. That was the beginning of what eventually became the medical microchip patent that sold for $5 million 2 years later. I had taught her how to think about miniaturization. She had done everything else. Back in the kitchen, the kettle had come to a boil and gone quiet again. Nora had powered on the phone and was composing a text message to Sylvia, her expression unhurried and focused, as though she were adjusting a delicate component under magnification. I got up to remake the tea and read the message over her shoulder before she sent it. "Hi Sylvia, thank you so much for the phone. It's really nice. Can I ask you something? I saw the words fiduciary duty in the papers. The lawyer sent Grandpa and I looked it up, but I'm still not sure I understand it. Could you explain what it means?" I set the teacups down. Nora sent the message and placed the phone face up on the table between us, and we both looked at it for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. "She'll answer," Nora said. "How do you know?" "Because she thinks I don't understand what I'm asking." 20 minutes and not one question about her. 2 days after Sylvia's visit, Dennis called on video. I was in the back room when the phone rang his name on the screen, a number I didn't recognize, which meant he had a new phone since the last time we'd spoken. I sat down at the small desk and answered. He looked better on screen than he had in the shop. He had shaved, and the lighting wherever he was calling from a hotel room, from the look of the wall behind him, was more forgiving than the gray November light of the Oregon coast. He smiled when my face appeared. "Dad, good you picked up. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I said honestly. He laughed as though that were a joke. "I just wanted to check in, make sure things were okay after the other day. I know it was a surprise showing up like that." "It was," I said. He talked for a while. He asked about the shop, whether business was still steady, whether I'd had any interesting repair jobs come in lately. He mentioned that he and Sylvia were staying up the coast for a few days, thinking it was good to be near family. He said the word family 3 times in the first 4 minutes. I counted. Then gradually the conversation shifted. He asked whether Nora's trust had been properly registered with the Oregon court. He asked who the trustee of record was, and whether I had my own legal representation. He asked whether the patent proceeds had been fully transferred into the trust, or whether some portion was still held in a personal account. He asked whether I had received paperwork from anyone in addition to his attorneys. I answered each question with as little information as possible, the way I had learned to answer questions I didn't want to answer, not with lies, but with the careful use of the truth. "Yes, I have an attorney. Yes, the paperwork is in order. I'll need to check on that. I'm not sure of the exact figures." 20 minutes into the call, I realized he had not asked a single question about Nora herself. Not about her health. Not about how she was managing her condition. Not about school or friends or what she was interested in or whether she was happy. Not one question that a father asks about a daughter he hasn't seen in 5 years. Every question had been about the money. "I should let you get back to your evening," he said, eventually settling back into the warm register he'd started with. I want you to know that Sylvia and I are coming from a place of genuine concern. Nora is family. We want what's best for her." "I know you said that," I said. After I ended the call, I sat in the dark back room for a while. The shop was closed, and the only light came from the small desk lamp and the glow of clocks on the walls. I thought about the conversation and tried to find something in it that I could hold on to, some thread of the sun I had raised, some genuine flicker beneath the performance. I was still looking when Nora appeared in the doorway. "How did it go?" she asked. "He didn't ask about you once," I said. "Not once in 20 minutes. She leaned against the doorframe. She didn't look surprised. "What did he ask about him?" "The trust, the accounts, my attorney, the patent proceeds." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Rex called while you were on with him. He wants you to come by tomorrow morning." I looked at her. "Did he say why?" "He said he found some things about Dad's finances that you need to hear before the first court date." She paused. He sounded like he meant it. 4 days after Sylvia had sent the phone, Nora showed me the message thread. I had not seen it until then. She had been managing it deliberately, she explained, composing each response carefully, asking questions that sounded like the natural curiosity of a teenager trying to understand a complicated situation. Sylvia had answered each one, and as the exchange continued, Sylvia had grown progressively more specific. I read through the messages at the kitchen table while Nora sat across from me. In one exchange, Nora had asked what would happen if a guardian was appointed for her. Sylvia had written back, "The court doesn't need to prove you're incapable of making decisions. They just need to establish that you're a minor with a documented neurological condition managing a significant asset." At that point, appointing a financial guardian is almost routine. The guardian would then have legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. In a follow-up message, Nora had asked whether the guardian would control everything. Sylvia had replied, "Once a financial guardian is appointed, all assets under the minor's name, including trust assets in many circumstances, fall under the guardian's management authority. It's really just a protective measure." I set the phone down on the table. In Oregon, as in most American states, a person under 18 cannot enter into binding financial contracts without a guardian's consent. However, a properly structured irrevocable trust, one that has already been executed with a court-recognized guardian acting on the minor's behalf, sits in a different legal category. What Sylvia's messages described was accurate for standard guardianship situations, but she had either overlooked or was unaware that Nora's trust had been specifically drafted to address this scenario. She had revealed her entire legal strategy to the person she was trying to outmaneuver because she had not considered that the person on the other end of those messages might understand exactly what she was saying. "She told you everything," I said. "She told me what she thinks will happen," Nora said, "which means we know exactly what we have to counter." She took the phone back and scrolled to the top of the thread. "I've already forwarded the full conversation to Rex, with the metadata showing it came from the phone she sent me, and the IP logs showing her account on the other end." I looked at my granddaughter across the kitchen table. Outside, the ocean was doing what it always did. Inside, the clocks ticked the way they always did. And Nora sat with the phone in her hands, entirely calm, the way she sat when a repair was going exactly as she had planned it. Rex called that evening. His voice was the careful, deliberate voice I had come to associate with things he had confirmed and not merely suspected. "Walter," he said, "come by in the morning. There's more than one thing I need to show you. 2.3 million and a warning." Rex's office was a single room at the end of a quiet street above a dry cleaning shop that had been there longer than either of us had lived in the neighborhood. The stairs creaked in a different place every season depending on the weather. I had been climbing them for years. That morning, the door was already unlocked when I arrived. Rex was at his desk with 3 folders open in front of him and a coffee going cold at his elbow. He looked up when I came in, gestured to the chair across from him, and waited until I had sat down and settled before he started. Condi home. I'm going to tell you some things, he said. Some of it comes from Frank DeLuca at the Portland field office, information from ongoing investigations that he's shared with me informally within what the rules allow. Some of it I found through public court filings. None of it is classified, but I want you to understand where it's coming from before you hear it. Go ahead, I said. He opened the first folder. Dennis had 2 outstanding Chapter 7 bankruptcy filings in the past 4 years, both in New York. I already knew this much from what Nora had found on Pacer. What I did not know was what came after. Following the second bankruptcy, Dennis had borrowed $2.3 million from a private lending organization based in New Jersey. This was not a bank. It was not a registered financial institution. It operated in the space between legal private lending and organized debt collection, and it charged interest accordingly. The repayment deadline on the principal was December 31st of this year, 6 weeks away. If he doesn't pay by the end of the year, Rex said, the consequences won't be handled in a courtroom. I understood what he meant without needing it explained further. He opened the second folder. For the past 18 months, the Securities and Exchange Commission had been conducting a preliminary investigation into a series of investment accounts Dennis had managed for private clients, 47 individuals in total, most of them retirees or small investors, who had trusted him with amounts between $20,000 and $50,000 each. The structure of the accounts had the characteristics of what investigators call a Ponzi scheme, a fraudulent arrangement, where returns paid to earlier investors are funded not by actual profits, but by money taken from newer investors with no underlying legitimate investment activity. The total amount involved was slightly over $800,000. Frank DeLuca had told Rex that a formal referral to the Department of Justice was likely within the next 90 days. A Ponzi scheme is a federal crime in the United States. Conviction carries a maximum sentence of 20 years per count. Rex closed the second folder. He is out of options, Walter. The guardianship petition isn't about Nora. It's about getting access to $5 million before December 31st. If he can be appointed her financial guardian, he gains legal authority to draw from her trust for what he would characterize as reasonable guardian expenses and family support costs. It wouldn't be clean, and it wouldn't hold up forever, but it would hold up long enough. I sat with that for a moment. The window behind Rex's desk looked out over the street below, where a woman was walking a large dog in the gray morning light. Ordinary things continuing in ordinary ways. You said there was more than one thing, I said. Rex was quiet for a few seconds. He closed the remaining folder without opening it. I've been looking at the accident report from when Claire died. The original report filed by the Portland PD. He looked at me carefully, the way he looked at things he was not yet ready to say with certainty. There are inconsistencies in it. Small ones, but the kind that someone who spent 30 years reading accident reports would notice. He paused. I flagged it to a contact at the FBI's Portland office. I'm waiting to hear back. I don't have anything confirmed yet. Rex, I know. Tell me what you're looking at. I'm not going to do that yet, he said. Because if I'm wrong, I don't want to have put something in your head that can't be taken out. And if I'm right, he stopped. If I'm right, I want to make sure we do it in the right order. Evidence first, then conclusions. I drove back to the shop in a state that I would not have been able to name precisely. Not panic, not grief exactly, though there was something of that in it. More like the sensation of a mechanism you thought you understood finally revealing a component you hadn't known was there. That evening after dinner, Nora brought something to the kitchen table. It was a small object, flat roughly the size of a postage stamp, so thin it was almost invisible when she laid it on the table between us. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. It looks like an NFC chip, I said. NFC stands for Near Field Communication, a short-range wireless technology used in things like contactless payment cards and access badges. It transmits a small amount of data when it comes within a few centimeters of a compatible reader. It's a passive one, she said. It doesn't broadcast on its own. It only responds when a reader is brought directly to it within about 4 centimeters. She picked it up between 2 fingers. When Sylvia left her folder on the counter last week, I embedded this in the spine of the cover while she was looking away. A passive NFC chip like this can store a unique identifier, a number, essentially. If anyone with a forensic scanner checks the physical folder, the chip confirms that this specific folder is the original document Sylvia brought in, not a substituted or altered copy. Why does that matter? Because I also photographed the reflection of Sylvia's laptop screen in the curved glass of the display case when she was reviewing the documents at the counter. The angle was narrow, but sufficient. From the reflection, I was able to extract the file metadata, the internal data that records when a digital document was created and when it was last modified. She set the chip down on the table. The document Sylvia presented to you as a medical support application was created 3 days after the date printed on the first page. The modification timestamps show additional edits made after the document was printed. That's called backdating, creating a document with a false date to make it appear it was prepared earlier than it actually was. Is that illegal? Well, in the context of a legal proceeding, yes. It's document fraud. She looked at me steadily. The chip doesn't prove the backdating on its own. But when our attorney has a forensic document examiner verify the metadata, which is standard practice in fraud cases, the chip will confirm that the folder being examined is the same one Sylvia brought here. It closes the chain of evidence. I looked at the small chip on the table between us. It was almost nothing. A postage stamp. A number stored in a device the size of a fingernail. You placed this while she was standing at the counter, I said. She was looking at you, Nora said. People look at the person they're trying to convince. The last gear. 2 nights after my visit to Rex, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual. I had been sleeping in shorter intervals since Dennis's visit, waking at 2 or 3 in the morning, with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had continued working while their body rested. Most nights I lay still and waited for it to pass. That night I got up, pulled on my work clothes, and went downstairs to the shop. The workroom at the back of the shop was the one place I had always been able to think clearly. Something about the smell of it, the specific quality of the silence, the way the work itself required a level of attention that crowded out everything else. I turned on the small lamp over the main bench and stood for a moment looking at the room. Then I looked at the large wall clock in the front of the shop. It was a Vienna regulator, a tall, pendulum-driven clock in a narrow wooden case that had hung on the wall behind the main counter for as long as I had owned the building. Customers noticed it. It was the kind of clock that drew the eye, which meant it was the kind of clock that anyone standing in the front room would naturally face at some point during a conversation. It had a clear view of the counter, the sitting area, and both doors. I went to the supply cabinet and found the components Nora had left in the 3rd drawer from the bottom, the medical-grade miniature camera modules she used in prototype testing for her device designs. They were roughly the size of a shirt button, capable of recording video and audio wirelessly to a paired tablet with a battery life of 72 hours. The lens was small enough to be nearly invisible at normal viewing distances. I carried the clock to the workbench and laid it carefully on its back. What I did next was not complicated, technically speaking. After 50 years of working inside clock mechanisms, I knew the interior of a Vienna regulator the way most people know their own handwriting. The mounting bracket for the pendulum suspension spring had a small cavity behind it, a space that existed purely for structural reasons and served no mechanical function. The camera module fit inside it with 2 millimeters to spare. I secured it with a small amount of watchmaker's adhesive, ran the wireless antenna along the back edge of the case where it would be invisible from the front, and paired the module with the tablet I kept locked in the workroom cabinet. The work took 40 minutes. My hands trembled the way they always did, but they did not miss. I rehung the clock on the wall and stood back. The pendulum swung. The seconds ticked. From the front of the room, it looked exactly as it had for 30 years. Every gear has its place, I thought, including this one. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of November morning that reminded you winter was not a future event, but something already underway. Dennis and Sylvia arrived at 10 minutes past 9 without calling ahead. I had the tablet running in the workroom before they reached the door. They came in together, Dennis in front, with that practiced ease he carried everywhere. Sylvia a half step behind, and to his left a positioning I had started to notice the way she placed herself to observe the room while he managed the conversation. They sat in the 2 chairs across the counter that I kept for customers, and Dennis opened with the kind of small talk that was clearly designed to establish a comfortable tone before getting to whatever he had actually come to say. Nora appeared from the back hallway about 5 minutes after they arrived. She was carrying her sketchbook, which she set on the counter beside her without comment. I noticed she had already written the date and time in the top right corner of the open page. Dennis looked at her with an expression that took visible effort to arrange. "Nora, you look well." "Thank you," she said. "We were hoping we'd get a chance to talk with you." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, adopting the posture of someone making a sincere effort at connection. "I know this whole situation has been stressful. Sylvia and I want you to know we're not here to make things harder. We're here because we care about what happens to you." Nora looked at him without expression, her pencil moving slowly across the page. She was not drawing. She was writing. "That's kind of you," she said. "What are you working on?" he asked, nodding at the sketchbook. "Notes," she said. Sylvia placed a manila envelope on the counter. "We've prepared a revised proposal," she said, her voice carrying the smooth reasonableness of someone accustomed to negotiating. A shared management structure, Dennis would have a formal advisory role in the oversight of the trust, with full court supervision and complete transparency. "We think it addresses the concerns the court will want to see resolved, and it keeps everything within the family." I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. Dennis tried once more with Nora. He asked what she liked most about living on the coast. He asked whether she found the work in the shop interesting. He asked whether she had things she wanted to do after she finished school. The questions were the right questions. They were just 5 years too late, and they landed with the hollow sound of things rehearsed rather than felt. Nora answered each one in a sentence or less, and wrote something after each answer. "What do you like best?" he asked finally. "From when you were little, I mean. Is there anything you remember that you enjoyed?" Nora stopped writing and looked at him directly. It was the first time she had held eye contact with him for more than a moment. "I liked it when adults told the truth," she said. The room was quiet for a beat. "I am telling the truth," Dennis said. "Okay," Nora said, and went back to her notes. Sylvia set a second document on top of the envelope. "This is our final offer before the first hearing. Sign before tomorrow evening, and we resolve everything privately, without the court having to make determinations that could be difficult for everyone involved." She looked at me with the expression of someone offering a reasonable compromise. It would be much simpler this way. Nora looked at the envelope and the document. She did not reach for either. "Could you leave those here?" she said. "Grandpa and I need to read through them carefully." After they left, I went directly to the workroom and opened the tablet. 51 minutes of recording audio, clear throughout, both faces visible for the majority of the session. I sent the file to Rex before I made coffee. Then I carried the envelope to the back room, where Nora was already waiting with the scanner on the table in front of her. "It's same as last time," I asked. "Scan everything before we touch it," she said. Then we read. "Before I show you what was hidden inside those documents, comment the number 9 right now, so I know you are still with me. Because what comes next changes everything you thought you understood about this family." A note: before we continue, the story ahead contains some fictional elements woven in for the purpose of storytelling and reflection. If that is not something you wish to hear, this is a comfortable place to stop. No hard feelings. What the documents hide. The scanner results came back in under 3 minutes. Nora had built a simple analysis workflow on her laptop, the kind of thing she put together the way I assembled a mainspring methodically and without unnecessary steps. The software read the embedded metadata from the digital files and returned a report in plain columns. File name, creation date, last modified date, author, field editing, software version, and a pixel-level integrity analysis of the printed pages. She turned the laptop so I could read the screen. The document Sylvia had presented that afternoon as a final settlement proposal had a creation date of 5 days before the date printed on its cover page. The modification log showed 3 separate edits made after the document had been printed identifiable, because the software left microscopic compression artifacts in the page image at the points where text had been added or changed after the fact. 2 of the altered clauses were in the section defining the scope of Dennis's proposed advisory authority. In the original version, that authority had been narrowly defined. In the altered version, it was broad enough to encompass virtually any financial decision made on Nora's behalf. "That's the second document," I said. "Same pattern as the first," Nora said. "Created earlier than dated, modified after printing." She printed the analysis report and added it to the folder she had started for the first document. 2 separate incidents of the same method. "I'll give this to Mr. Bale when we meet with him. He'll have a forensic document examiner confirm it independently. That's the standard process for submitting this kind of evidence in a fraud proceeding." I looked at the 2 folders side by side on the table. Sylvia Marsh had brought fraudulent documents into my shop twice on 2 separate occasions, apparently operating on the assumption that no one in a small watchmaker's house on the Oregon coast would know how to look at what she was handing them. "Does she know you found this?" I asked. "No," Nora said. "And I'd like to keep it that way until the hearing." I went to bed that night with the folder locked in the workroom cabinet and the tablet charged and running. I lay awake for a while listening to the ocean, which had no opinion about any of it, and eventually slept. The next morning, Rex called before 8. His office was colder than usual when I arrived. He had forgotten to turn the heat on, or more likely hadn't noticed, which told me he had been there for a while before I showed up. He had 2 folders on his desk and a legal pad covered in handwriting beside them. He waited until I had closed the door and sat down before he started. "I want to be precise about what I'm going to tell you," he said, "because the line between what I know and what I suspect matters a great deal here, and I'm not going to blur it." "All right," I said. When I flagged the inconsistencies in Claire's accident report to my contact at the FBI's Portland office, they ran a standard cross-reference against her medical records. He opened the first folder. Under normal circumstances, medical records are protected under federal privacy law, specifically the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which means no one can access them without the patient's consent or a valid legal order. Because Claire is deceased, and the matter involves a potential criminal investigation, the FBI obtained a warrant from a federal magistrate judge. That warrant authorized them to retrieve her full medical file from the hospital in Portland. He turned the folder to face me. There were 2 sets of documents, a standard medical summary, I recognized as the kind of record that gets shared with family in routine circumstances, and a second set that was considerably more detailed. The second set was requested by a physician whose name does not appear anywhere in Claire's primary treatment record. Someone ordered additional blood work outside the normal care protocol, and that blood work was filed separately in the hospital's archive rather than in her main chart. I looked at the name on the secondary request form. I didn't recognize it. The results of that blood work, Rex said carefully, show concentrations of a central nervous system depressant at levels inconsistent with any prescribed therapeutic dose. The FBI's toxicologist is currently reviewing the sample against the timeline of the accident. He closed the folder. I want to be clear, this is preliminary. The toxicologist has not issued a final determination, but the preliminary assessment is that the concentration found is consistent with a dose administered within 48 hours of the accident, a dose sufficient to cause significant cognitive and physical impairment. The room was very quiet. Through the window, I could see the street below a delivery truck idling at the corner, a woman walking past with a coffee cup. The ordinary morning continuing. Rex, I said. I know. If this is what it looks like, why, then it wasn't an accident, he said. He said it quietly and without drama, the way he said things he had already spent a long time thinking about. And if it wasn't an accident, then Dennis didn't just abandon his daughter. He created the circumstances that left her without a mother. He looked at me steadily. I'm sorry, Walter. I know what Claire meant to this family. I thought about the night she had stood at my door in the rain, the bruise under her collar, the way she had looked at me before she left, not asking for help, just asking me to keep Nora safe. As if she already knew she was running out of time to ask anyone for anything. Does Sylvia know? I asked. Rex picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. That's the next question I need to answer. My instinct says yes, but instinct isn't evidence, and we need evidence. He leaned back in his chair. I want you to sit on this until the civil hearing. Don't tell Dennis, don't change anything about how you're behaving toward either of them. If Dennis realizes the criminal investigation is closing in, he'll run. I drove back to the shop along the coast road with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. My hands trembled the way they always did. The ocean was flat and gray on my left, running all the way to a horizon I couldn't see. Claire had brought Nora to me because she was afraid. She had been right to be afraid. And I had spent 5 years telling myself a story about wet roads and accidents because the alternative was something I hadn't had the courage to face. I was facing it now. When I walked back into the shop, Nora was at the workbench with a pocket watch open in front of her, working in the careful, unhurried way she always worked. She looked up when I came in, read something in my face, and looked back down at the watch without asking. She already knew something had shifted. She didn't push. That was one of the things about Nora she understood, that some information had to arrive at its own pace. The debt she bought. The morning after my visit to Rex, I came downstairs to find Nora already at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside her. She had been up for a while. I could tell by the way she was sitting the particular stillness of someone who has finished thinking and is now waiting for the right moment to speak. I poured coffee and sat down across from her without asking what she was looking at. She would tell me when she was ready. She turned the laptop to face me after about a minute. On the screen was an account portal for a small Portland law firm I didn't recognize, Harwick and Associates Estate and Financial Law, established in 2011. There was a transaction summary open on the page dated 4 months earlier. I need to tell you something, Nora said. And I need you to hear all of it before you respond. All right, I said. 4 months ago, I asked you to sign a set of documents from this firm. I told you they were related to renewing the liability coverage on the shop's equipment inventory. She paused. They weren't. I looked at her. I remembered the afternoon, a Tuesday, I thought, because she had come home from tutoring early and found me in the middle of cleaning a carriage clock movement. She had set 3 pages on the bench beside me with the relevant lines marked with small yellow tabs, and I had signed where indicated without reading past the summary she had prepared. I had been doing this for years with Nora's paperwork. It had never occurred to me to question it. What did I sign? I asked. Chikaesum. A purchase agreement, she said. Through this firm acting as your agent in your capacity as my legal guardian, you authorized the acquisition of a debt instrument from a private lending organization in New Jersey. She clicked to the next page of the portal. Dennis's $2.3 million loan. We bought it. I sat with that for a moment. In the United States, debt instruments, including loans made by private lenders, can be bought and sold between parties in what is known as the secondary debt market. When a lender believes a borrower is unlikely to repay, they will often sell the debt to a third party at a discount rather than pursue costly collection efforts. The purchasing party then becomes the new creditor, the entity to whom the debt is legally owed. Funds came from the patent proceeds, the same $5 million Dennis was trying to reach. Nora had directed a portion of it at the time the trust was established into a separate account, specifically for this purpose. She had planned the acquisition before the ink on the licensing agreement was dry. Dennis was coming to court to claim authority over his daughter's finances. His daughter was already his creditor. He owes you $2.3 million, I said. Legally, yes. Nora wrapped her hands around her teacup. If he had succeeded in being appointed my financial guardian, he would have gained access to the trust. But the debt he owes would have remained, and as his creditor, the trust would have had a senior claim against any assets he controlled, including any distributions he tried to take. She looked at me steadily. It was a failsafe. If everything else didn't work, this would have made it functionally impossible for him to extract money without triggering his own debt obligation. I looked at the transaction summary on the screen. $1,380,000 authorized under my signature 4 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon while I was cleaning a carriage clock. Nora, I said. I know, she said quietly. I should have told you. I didn't because I knew you'd worry from the moment you found out, and I needed you to behave normally around Dennis and Sylvia. If you had known, it would have shown. She paused. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I handled it the way I thought was safest for you. I looked at her for a long time. Then I laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised me when it came out. Not because anything was funny, but because there was something so precisely like Nora in the logic of what she had done that I didn't know what else to do with it. That evening, I checked the camera tablet before dinner. The recording from the previous night showed Dennis and Sylvia entering the shop at 11:47 in the evening. Dennis used a key, an old brass key, that I recognized as the spare I had given him when he was 17, and had a habit of coming home after I locked up. I had not thought about that key in decades. I had not thought to change the locks. They were in the shop for 38 minutes. Dennis went through the filing cabinet beside the counter, while Sylvia photographed documents on the workbench with her phone. She tried the small lockbox I kept on the top shelf. It was empty because I had moved its contents to the workroom safe 2 days earlier, on a feeling I hadn't been able to explain at the time. Before they left, Sylvia stood near the center of the room and spoke in a low voice that the camera's microphone caught clearly. He's hidden things better than I expected, she said. But it doesn't matter at the hearing. We don't need to find anything. We just need to argue that a 70-year-old man with trembling hands isn't a competent financial guardian for a minor managing assets of this size. Dennis said nothing. He looked around the shop one more time with an expression I had no interest in trying to read, and then they left. In Oregon, entering a property without permission, even with a key obtained legitimately years earlier, constitutes trespass when the owner has not granted current authorization. If the entry is made with the intent to commit a crime such as stealing documents or obtaining information to be used fraudulently, the charge escalates to burglary in the second degree. I sent the recording to Rex at 7 in the morning with a message that said only "last night." All of it. Rex responded 40 minutes later. "Come by the coffee shop across from the shop. Don't go inside yet." I walked across the street and found him already at a window table with 2 cups. He nodded toward a parked sedan on the far side of the street, a dark blue 4-door with a man sitting in the driver's seat reading something on his phone. "He's been there since 6:30, Rex said. "I've seen him before. 3 times in the past 2 weeks, always within sight of your shop." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "Dennis hired him about 6 months ago. I ran the plates this morning. 6 months ago. Before the patent sale had even been publicly recorded. Before the legal petition. Before any of this had been visible from the outside." "He's been planning this since before Nora sold the patent," I said. "He knew it was coming," Rex said. "He had someone watching to confirm the timing." He looked at me across the table. "Walter, this was never an impulsive decision. This was a campaign." I looked at the man in the sedan, who was still reading his phone, and had no idea he had already been identified. Outside, the Oregon coast fog was beginning to thin for the first time in days, burning off slowly in the pale morning light. The quiet week and Mr. Bale, the days between Rex's revelation and the first court hearing, passed in a way I can only describe as industrious silence. The shop opened each morning at the usual hour. Repairs came in and went out. I ate dinner with Nora every evening, and we talked about ordinary things, a mantel clock that needed a new escape wheel, a book she was reading about semiconductor materials, whether the weather would clear before Thanksgiving. We did not talk about Dennis or Sylvia or the hearing. There was nothing useful left to say about any of it. The preparation was done or it wasn't. What I did not tell Nora during that week was what Rex had told me about Claire's medical records. I had thought carefully about the timing. She was 15 years old, and she had been carrying the weight of this situation, the planning, the preparation, the quiet management of things I hadn't known needed managing for 2 years, without telling me. I did not want to put the full weight of what Rex had found on her shoulders before the civil hearing was resolved. There would be time for that afterward. There had to be. A new letter arrived from Sylvia's attorneys 8 days after Dennis and Sylvia's Saturday visit. They had expanded the petition. In addition to the original guardianship application, they were now filing a separate action contesting my ownership of the shop building itself, arguing that the property had been partially funded through family assets during the period of Dennis's childhood, and therefore represented a marital or inheritance interest he was entitled to claim. They were also formally requesting that the court appoint an independent psychologist to evaluate my cognitive fitness as Nora's guardian, citing in careful legal language concerns about the judgment and decision-making capacity of an elderly person managing significant financial assets. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table while Nora was in the other room. Then I folded it and put it in the folder with everything else. The shop building argument had no legal foundation. In Oregon, property owned solely in one person's name, purchased with that person's documented funds, belongs to that person regardless of family relationships, and Dennis had contributed nothing to this building in any form at any time. A competent judge would recognize the claim for what it was, a pressure tactic designed to multiply the cost and complexity of defending against the primary petition. The psychological evaluation request was more deliberately unpleasant because its purpose was not to win a legal argument, but to suggest one to plant in the court's mind the image of a frail old man with shaking hands, who perhaps could not be trusted, with a 15-year-old girl's $5 million. It was in its way the most efficient thing Sylvia had done. It cost her nothing to file, and forced me to spend time and money responding to a premise I found offensive. I called Thomas Bale that afternoon. I had reached out to Bale the week before, using the contact information Rex's deputy district attorney card had led me to. Bale had worked alongside that office on several civil matters and came with Rex's informal endorsement, which was the only endorsement I needed. He was a family law and civil litigation attorney based in Portland, mid-50s, with the kind of unhurried telephone manner that suggested he had heard most things at least once before and was rarely rattled by any of them. We met at his office 10 days before the first scheduled hearing. His office was clean and orderly in the way that working offices rarely managed to be. Every folder had a place. Every surface was clear except for what was actively being used. He shook our hands when we arrived, gestured us to the chairs across from his desk, and then spent the next 20 minutes reading through everything Nora had prepared without speaking. When he finished, he set the last folder down and was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he asked Nora. "The documentation itself about 3 weeks," she said. "The preparation behind it about 2 years." Bale looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone recalibrating something. Then he looked at me, and I could see him doing the same thing. "The metadata analysis," he said. "I'll need to have this confirmed by a forensic document examiner before we can submit it as evidence. That's standard procedure. A court won't accept self-generated analysis from an interested party. But if an independent examiner reaches the same conclusions, it becomes admissible and carries significant weight." He tapped the folder. "I have someone I use regularly. I'll send this to him today." "How long will that take?" I asked. 4 to 5 days. We have time before the hearing." He made a note on his legal pad. "The NFC chip in the document cover, I want to have that verified as well. It doesn't prove the backdating on its own, but it closes a potential argument about chain of custody. Defense counsel could argue the documents were substituted or tampered with after Sylvia left them. The chip eliminates that argument." He moved to the expanded petition, the shop building claim, and the psychological evaluation request. He addressed both with the same unhurried efficiency. The building claim, he said, was without legal merit and would be disposed of in a preliminary motion. The evaluation request was more useful to them than it appeared, because it gave us the opportunity to request our own independent psychiatric evaluation by a physician of our choosing, which would produce a documented professional assessment of my fitness as guardian, an assessment that would directly contradict the insinuation Sylvia's filing was designed to create. "I'd like to schedule that evaluation before the hearing," he said. "This week, if possible." "Fine," I said. He looked at Nora again. "Is there anything else I should know before the hearing? Anything in the preparation you haven't walked me through yet?" Nora looked at me. It was a brief look, a question, not a hesitation. I gave her the small nod she was waiting for. She looked back at Bale. "Yes," she said. "But that part Grandpa will present." "Not me." Bale looked at me with the expression of a man who had just been told that the case he thought he understood had at least one more layer. "All right," he said. He wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it. "I'll look forward to hearing it." On the drive home, Nora looked out the passenger window at the coast road running alongside us. The ocean was visible between the trees, gray and flat and very wide. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for a while," I said. "I just didn't know it yet." She turned back to the window. I kept driving. In my jacket pocket, the old pocket watch ticked against my chest, the way it always had steady, unhurried marking time, the way it had been built to do. The courthouse smelled the way I imagined it would, antiseptic floors, old wood, and the particular stillness of a room where people came to prove things. I had been in this building once before 31 years ago to sign adoption papers for Dennis when he was 11. That morning, I had felt nothing but hope. Standing in the corridor now, I understood how thoroughly a place could hold two entirely opposite memories at once. Nora walked beside me in a dark navy dress she had pressed herself the night before. She carried a small leather folder, the same one she used in the shop to sketch gear mechanisms, and I noticed she had not eaten breakfast. When I asked, she said she was not hungry, then immediately reached over and straightened my tie without being asked. That was how she managed things she could not say out loud. Thomas Bale met us at the entrance to courtroom 4. He was a compact man in his early 60s, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up onto his forehead, and he spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had learned long ago that precision mattered more than volume. He had spent the previous week filing our counter-petition under Oregon Revised Statute 125.305, which allows an interested party to formally contest a guardianship application on grounds of petitioner misconduct. The filing cited 4 items: the backdated medical support document, the metadata analysis Nora had prepared, the security footage from the shop, and the voluntary text disclosures Sylvia had made to Nora's phone over the preceding weeks. "They haven't seen all of it," Thomas said quietly, adjusting the stack of folders under his arm. "Their attorney requested discovery 2 days ago. I submitted the minimum required. The rest goes in this morning as supplemental evidence." Nora looked at him. "Is that allowed?" "Supplemental evidence is permitted when it becomes available within 48 hours of the hearing. The footage timestamp is from 6 days ago, but the full forensic analysis of the NFC chip was only certified yesterday afternoon." He paused. "So yes, it is allowed." Dennis and Sylvia arrived 11 minutes before the session opened. I watched them from across the corridor. Sylvia was dressed in a charcoal suit I had not seen before, her briefcase a slim, expensive rectangle. Dennis wore a tie that was slightly too tight, and he kept touching the knot. He did not look in our direction. Sylvia did once, briefly, and then said something to Dennis that made him straighten his shoulders. I had spent 40 years reading the small adjustments people made when they were trying to appear more certain than they felt. I recognized the posture. The hearing opened with Judge Marilyn Thorne presiding. She was methodical and unhurried, the kind of judge who read every page before anyone spoke. Dennis's attorney, a Portland-based family law specialist named Craig Elliott, presented the guardianship petition, first framing it around Nora's cataplexy diagnosis and what he described as the financial complexity of managing a trust instrument on behalf of a minor. He used the phrase, "in the child's best interest," 7 times. I counted. Thomas waited. When Judge Thorne asked for the respondent's position, he stood and submitted the supplemental evidence packet without preamble. He explained the backdated document, walking the judge through the metadata timestamps and the pixel artifact analysis that identified post-print alterations. He played 40 seconds of the security footage Dennis and Sylvia inside the locked shop at 11:47 at night, and identified it by the timestamp embedded in the camera file. He then submitted the certified forensic report on the NFC chip, which confirmed the folder Dennis had brought to the negotiation meeting contained a passive identifier linked to the original document creation date, placing its origin 5 days before the date printed on the face of the document. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Craig Elliott requested a recess. Judge Thorne denied it. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. Sylvia leaned over and spoke into Dennis's ear. Dennis stared at the table. Craig Elliott requested permission to confer with his client. Judge Thorne granted 2 minutes. At the end of those 2 minutes, Craig Elliott stood and said that his client wished to withdraw the guardianship petition without prejudice, meaning Dennis reserved the right to refile at a later date under different circumstances. Thomas was already on his feet. Your Honor, the respondent requests that the withdrawal be entered with prejudice given the evidence of document fraud now in the court record. Judge Thorne looked at the packet in front of her for a long moment. I'm going to take that under advisement and issue a written ruling by the end of the week. In the meantime, I'm referring the forensic materials to the District Attorney's Office for review under ORS 162.065 first-degree forgery. She looked at Craig Elliott. Counsel, I'd advise your client to remain available. Outside in the corridor, Nora stood very still with her leather folder held against her chest. Rex was waiting by the exit doors. He had not been permitted inside as a witness, but had arrived anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. I watched him read her expression and nod slowly the way one person confirms to another that something important has just occurred. I did not feel relief exactly. Relief was for situations that were over. I felt instead the specific alertness of someone who had just seen the first card turned over in a game where most of the deck was still face down. On the drive home, Nora opened the leather folder on her lap and made a small notation I could not read. When I asked what she was writing, she closed the folder and looked at the road ahead. There's something Rex didn't tell you this morning, she said. He told me last night about the man in the dark blue sedan. She waited until I had parked the car before she spoke again. Not because she was afraid of the words, I think, but because she wanted me to be still when she said them. We sat in the driveway for a moment. The afternoon light came through the windshield at a low angle and turned everything the color of old brass. I turned off the engine and did not move. His name is Victor Hale, Nora said. He used to work for the same private equity firm that gave Dennis the $2.3 million loan. Rex found his name through the plate number DMV records cross-referenced through his FBI contact. Victor Hale left the firm 14 months ago, 2 months after Mom's accident. I did not say anything immediately. There are moments when the mind receives information and needs a few seconds to find somewhere to put it. I had repaired enough clocks to know that when a gear slips, you do not force it back. You wait and you find the tooth. Rex thinks he wasn't just watching the shop, Nora continued. He thinks Victor Hale was here to make sure you didn't talk to anyone, or that I didn't. She looked at her hands on the folder in her lap. Rex said he flagged it to the FBI 3 weeks ago. They've been running their own surveillance on Victor since then. I asked her why Rex had told her and not me. She was quiet for a moment. Because he wasn't sure how you'd react, she said. And because I asked him to tell me first. We went inside. I made coffee I did not drink, and Nora sat at the kitchen table with her folder open, writing in the small, precise script she used for gear measurements, and apparently also for things that frightened her. I watched her the way I had watched her since she was 7 years old, not hovering just present the way you stay near a mechanism that is running under unusual load. Rex arrived at 6:15. He had the specific tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for longer than he wanted to admit. He sat down at the kitchen table without taking off his coat, which told me the visit was not going to be brief. He laid a folder on the table. Inside was a printed DMV record, a photograph taken from across the street. Dark blue sedan partial license plate, a man in his late 40s at the wheel, and a 1-page summary on what he described as a preliminary FBI profile. Victor Hale, 49 years old, former risk analyst, left the lending firm under circumstances that were not listed as voluntary resignation in the record. He had been seen near the shop on 11 separate occasions over 6 months. The first date on the log was 4 days after Dennis had filed the initial guardianship petition in early November. He wasn't improvising, Rex said. Someone told him when to start. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The man in the car had the particular blankness of someone trained to wait without expression. I had seen that look before on a different face in a different context, and it took me a moment to place it. Then I placed it. Dennis brought him to the shop, I said. The first visit. He was in the car while Dennis and Sylvia came inside. Rex looked at me carefully. You're sure? I noticed a car parked across the street the entire time they were here. I assumed it was a neighbor. Dark blue, newer model. I didn't look at the plate. Rex made a note in the margin of his folder. Then he said what he had clearly come to say. Walter, the FBI toxicology report on Claire. The preliminary one I showed you has been upgraded. The certified analysis came back 48 hours ago. The CNS depressant concentration in her second blood work panel was consistent with a dose administered between 36 and 48 hours before the accident. Not accidental ingestion. Not a prescription interaction. He paused. They're treating it as a potential homicide investigation. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the wall above the stove, a simple pendulum movement I had serviced myself 3 years ago, marked the seconds the way it always did, indifferent and exact. Nora did not look up from her folder. She said without inflection, I know. I turned to her. She met my eyes, and I understood in the way that you sometimes understand things, before they are fully explained, that she had known for longer than I had. Not everything, but enough. Enough to have started preparing 2 years ago at age 13, when she first opened Pacer on her school laptop and typed her father's name into the search field. I asked her how long. Since the week after the funeral, she said. Mom called me the morning of the accident. She said she had found something in Dennis's files, and she was going to take it to a lawyer that afternoon. She closed her folder. She never made it to the lawyer. Rex sat very still. I sat very still. Outside, the Oregon evening came in quietly off the coast, and somewhere down the street a neighbor's light came on, and the world continued to operate as though nothing fundamental had just shifted inside this kitchen. We need to talk about what happens next, Rex said finally. Nora looked at him with the calm, measured focus she used when she was reassembling a mechanism she had taken apart the night before, every piece accounted, for every action deliberate. I know what happens next, she said. I've known since November. Before I tell you what this 15-year-old girl had planned from the very beginning, leave a clock emoji or just the word ready in the comments. Because I promise you, nothing in this story is what it first appeared to be. A gentle reminder, the chapters ahead carry some fictional elements crafted carefully for the lesson they hold. You are always welcome to stop here, but something tells me you have been waiting for exactly this moment. I woke at 5 in the morning and lay still for a while listening to the house. There was no sound from Nora's room, which meant she was either asleep or had been awake long enough to stop moving. With Nora, the two were sometimes indistinguishable. I had repaired clocks for 50 years. I understood in a way that was almost physical the difference between a mechanism running on its own momentum and one that had been set in motion by a deliberate hand. Lying there in the dark, I began to understand that everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks, the envelope from New York, the phone Sylvia sent the negotiation, the hearing, the camera in the Vienna regulator, the debt purchase, all of it had not simply unfolded. It had been arranged. And the hand that arranged it had been smaller than mine and steadier. Nora was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. She had made coffee and set out 2 cups, which meant she had heard me moving and had timed it. In front of her were 3 folders, a yellow legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting, and the leather gear sketchbook she carried everywhere. She looked up when I sat down and said without preamble, "I need to show you something." She opened the first folder. Inside was a timeline she had drawn by hand, beginning 2 years earlier in December of 2023 when she was 13. It showed in sequence every action she had taken and the reason behind each one. The Pacer search that found Dennis's first bankruptcy filing. The conversation with a trust attorney she had contacted by email, presenting herself as inquiring on behalf of a family member. The draft trust document she had prepared and brought to me 8 months ago, which I had signed without fully understanding its architecture. The patent proceeds directed into the trust the day the licensing agreement was finalized. The secondary debt market research begun 4 months ago, when she confirmed the loan's maturity date. The purchase of Dennis's debt through Harwick and Associates completed 6 weeks before Dennis arrived at the shop. I sat with this for a long moment. "You were 13 when you started," I said. 12, she said. "The week after Mom's funeral." I didn't know everything then. I only knew that Dennis had filed for bankruptcy twice and that Mom had been afraid of him for the last year of her life. She turned a page on the legal pad. The rest I figured out as I went. The second folder contained the debt instrument itself, a formal assignment agreement, transferring Dennis's $2.3 million loan obligation from the original private lender to a holding entity registered in Delaware. The holding entity's beneficial owner, as listed in the trust document, was Nora Elaine Greer. Thomas Bale had reviewed every page. The transaction had been executed legally with full documentation at 60 cents on the dollar. When the loan matures on December 31st, Nora said, "Dennis will owe the full balance to the holding entity, which means he will owe it to me." She said this without triumph, in the same tone she used to describe the escapement mechanism of a watch she was studying. If he can't pay, Thomas can file for a civil judgment and request asset freezing under Oregon Rule of Civil Procedure 83. That includes any legal fees he might use to refile the guardianship petition. I looked at her across the table. I had known this child since the afternoon she was born, had watched her learn to walk on the shop floor between the display cases, had taught her the name of every gear and spring and jewel in a movement. I had thought in my better moments that I understood her. I understood now that I had understood perhaps half. "There's a third folder," I said. She nodded and opened it. Inside were printed copies of the text exchanges between Nora and Sylvia annotated in red pen with legal citations Thomas had added. Beside them were 2 printed transcripts, one from the shop's camera recording of the negotiation meeting, one from the break-in footage, each with specific passages bracketed. Attached to the back was a 1-page memo from Thomas Bale listing the charges the district attorney's office could pursue based on the available evidence: first-degree forgery under ORS 162.065, second-degree burglary under ORS 164.215, and a civil fraud claim linked to the guardianship petition's false representations. Thomas submitted the annotated transcripts to the DA's office yesterday morning, Nora said. Before the hearing. I set down my coffee cup. "Before the hearing," I repeated. I wanted the DA to have everything before Dennis had a chance to withdraw and walk away clean. She looked at me steadily. "Withdrawing the petition doesn't erase the forgery. It doesn't erase the break-in. Those are separate matters." Rex arrived at 7:30. He came in without knocking, which he had started doing sometime in the past 2 weeks, and poured himself coffee and sat down. He looked at the folders on the table and then at Nora and said, "You told him." "I told him," she said. Rex set his cup down and looked at me with an expression. I recognized the specific look of a man who has been carrying a secret on behalf of someone else and is relieved to put it down. "She came to me 6 weeks ago," he said. "The day before Dennis first showed up. She laid out the full picture, and asked me to verify the financial records independently. I did. Everything she told me checked out. He paused. I've been in law enforcement for 38 years, Walter. I have never in my life been briefed more thoroughly by anyone, let alone a 15-year-old. Outside, the December morning was gray and still. The shop would open in 2 hours. In 11 days, Dennis's loan would mature, and the balance would come due. Somewhere across town, a district attorney's office was reviewing a packet of evidence that had been assembled piece by piece by a girl who had started the work at age 12 with nothing but a school laptop, a public database, and the specific patient grief of someone who had decided that understanding was the only form of safety available to her. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held mine the way she had when she was small, and the shop was dark, and she was not yet afraid of anything. "What do we do now?" I asked. She looked at the folders on the table. "Now we wait," she said, and we let it finish. The week before Christmas passed, the way the final minutes of a long repair job pass slowly, with the particular tension of someone who has done everything correctly and is now simply waiting to find out if it was enough. I opened the shop each morning at 8. I serviced 3 pocket watches, 1 mantel clock, and a marine chronometer that a retired naval officer had brought in from the coast. I did the work carefully and charged fair prices and spoke to my customers about the weather and the holidays, and none of them knew that in the back room on a shelf above the workbench, a tablet was connected to a security camera inside a Vienna regulator, and that on my phone there was a folder containing evidence that had already been submitted to a district attorney's office and an FBI field office and a circuit court judge who was expected to issue a written ruling before the end of the year. Nora spent the week in a rhythm that looked from the outside like the ordinary routine of a 15-year-old on winter break. She read. She worked on a small carriage clock movement she had been restoring since October. She cooked dinner twice, both times producing something better than I would have managed. She checked her phone with the measured infrequency of someone who is expecting a specific message and has decided that checking more often will not make it arrive sooner. On the evening of December 22nd, Thomas Bale called. He said the district attorney's office had reviewed the full evidence packet and was moving forward with charges. First-degree forgery under ORS 162.065, second-degree burglary under ORS 164.215, and civil fraud in connection with the guardianship petition. He said the DA preferred to time the filing carefully coordinating with the FBI, which had formally opened a homicide investigation into Claire's death 2 days earlier. Thomas used the word coordination in the way lawyers use it when they mean that multiple agencies are working toward a single moment. I told Nora after I hung up. She was at the kitchen table with the carriage clock movement spread out on a cloth in front of her, a loop on a chain around her neck. She listened without putting down her tools. When I finished, she held a small escape wheel up to the light and examined it for a moment, before setting it back on the cloth. "Did he say when?" she asked. "Before the end of the year," I said. "He said to be prepared for things to move quickly after December 31st. She nodded and picked up her tweezers. Rex came by on December 23rd with a bottle of cider and the specific expression of a man who was trying to make a social visit out of what was actually a briefing. He sat in the armchair by the front window, the one that had been my wife Margaret's, and told us that Victor Hale had been formally interviewed by the FBI 2 days earlier. Hale had retained a lawyer and had not answered substantive questions, but his presence in Oregon over 6 months, his documented proximity to the shop, and his employment history at the lending firm had all been entered into the federal investigation record. Rex said the FBI's working theory was that Hale had been retained to monitor and, if necessary, discourage anyone who might interfere with Dennis's plan to access Nora's trust before the loan came due. "Discourage," I said. Rex looked at me steadily. That's the word they used. On Christmas Eve, Nora and I did what we had done every year since Claire brought her to live with me. We sat at the workbench together, and I showed her something new. It had started when she was 7 with a simple lever escapement. Over the years, we had worked through a cylinder escapement, a duplex, a detente, and last year, a tourbillon. This year, I had set aside a complicated pocket watch with a minute repeater mechanism, the kind that chimes the hours, quarters, and minutes on demand. I had been saving it for a year that felt significant enough. We worked for 2 hours. I explained the all-or-nothing piece, the rack and snail, the way the hammer train separated from the going train. Nora listened and asked precise questions and made notes in the gear sketchbook. At some point, she stopped writing and simply watched my hands the way she had as a small child. And I thought about Claire sitting in this same shop on winter evenings, watching in the same way, with the same expression of concentrated attention. I did not say this out loud. Some things are better kept as the feeling behind the words. At 11:40 on the night of December 30th, my phone rang. It was Thomas Bale, which was unusual enough at that hour that I was fully awake before I answered. Dennis's loan matured at midnight tonight, he said. Oregon time. The full balance of $2.3 million is now due and payable to the holding entity. He paused. I've been in contact with his attorney. Dennis cannot pay. He has requested an extension. What did you say on? I asked. I said no, Thomas said. I'll file the emergency asset freeze petition first thing tomorrow morning under Oregon Rule of Civil Procedure 83. Once that's granted, Dennis will not be able to move, transfer, or encumber any assets pending resolution of the debt claim. Another pause, shorter this time. Walter, I also received a call this evening from the FBI. They've asked that we not discuss the details of the civil filing publicly until after they have completed a related action they have scheduled for the morning of December 31st. I stood in the hallway in the dark for a moment after he hung up. Through the wall, I could hear the faint, steady tick of the mantel clock in the sitting room, a 30-year-old movement I had serviced so many times I knew every sound it made. Behind me, at the top of the stairs, Nora's door opened. Thomas, she asked quietly. Yes, I said. She stood at the top of the stairs in the dark, and I could not see her expression, only the outline of her against the faint light from her room. Tomorrow morning, she said. It was not a question. Tomorrow morning, I said. She went back into her room and closed the door softly, and I stood in the hallway a little longer, listening to the clock, thinking about the minute repeater on the workbench, and about the way a complicated mechanism will sometimes run for decades. In silence, keeping perfect time, waiting for the moment someone finally asks it to chime. I was in the shop before 6. Not because there was work to do, the shop was closed for the holiday, but because it was the only place I knew how to be still. I had spent 50 years learning that the workbench was where I thought most clearly, and this was not a morning for unclear thinking. I turned on the lamp above the bench and sat down without taking off my coat. The minute repeater was still there on the cloth where Nora and I had left it on Christmas Eve, fully assembled. Now the case closed. I picked it up and pressed the repeating slide and listened to it chime 2 hours, 1/4, 4 minutes. The small hammer train running through its sequence with the unhurried precision of something that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to keep doing it regardless of what was happening in the world outside. Rex arrived at 6:15. He knocked this time, which told me something formal was about to occur. He came in and stood on the customer side of the display cases, which he had never done before, and said that he had spoken with his FBI contact at 5:30 that morning. The arrest warrant for Dennis Greer had been executed at 5:52. Dennis had been taken into federal custody at the Portland address he and Sylvia were renting without incident. The charges on the warrant included wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343 conspiracy to commit fraud and one count of homicide by abuse under Oregon law, pending the formal grand jury indictment that the U.S. Attorney's Office expected to return within the week. I set the pocket watch down on the cloth. Sylvia cocked, I asked. Interviewed and released pending further investigation, Rex said. The FBI is looking at her involvement in the document fraud and the guardianship petition. Her bar association has been notified. He paused. She cooperated. I asked him what that meant. It means she told them things, he said. About Dennis, about Victor Hale, about the loan and who arranged the surveillance. He looked at the display cases for a moment at the watches inside. It means she understood which way things were moving and made a calculation. Thomas Bale called at 7:40. He said the emergency asset freeze petition had been filed with the Oregon Circuit Court at 7 o'clock, and a duty judge had granted the temporary order within 20 minutes, which he described as unusually fast, but not surprising, given the federal arrest that morning. Dennis's known assets, 2 bank accounts, a leased vehicle, and a partial interest in a Portland commercial property, were now frozen pending resolution of the debt claim. Thomas said the $2.3 million judgment would likely be settled through the asset liquidation process, which would take several months, but that the legal framework was secure. Nora's trust is untouched, he said. The patent precedes the trust structure, all of it, exactly as she designed it. I thanked him and hung up and stood in the shop for a while, without doing anything in particular. Outside, the last morning of December was coming in gray and cold off the coast, the way Oregon mornings did in winter, indifferent to calendars and conclusions. Nora came downstairs at 8. She was dressed, which meant she had been awake for some time. She came into the shop through the connecting door and looked at my face and understood immediately the way she always did. I told her everything. I told her about the arrest, the charges, the asset freeze, Sylvia's cooperation, Thomas's call. I told her in the order it had happened, without editorializing the way I would describe the sequence of a repair. This happened then this. She stood on the customer side of the display cases and listened without interrupting, her hands at her sides, her face very still. When I finished, she did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at the display cases, at the watches inside, the pocket watches and wristwatches, and the small carriage clock she had restored herself, which I had placed in the front row of the center case the week before because it deserved to be seen. Then she sat down on the floor, not the way someone sits when they are tired or unwell. She simply folded herself down until she was sitting on the wooden floor of the shop, with her back against the display case, and her knees drawn up and her face in her hands. I came around the counter and sat down on the floor beside her because there was nothing else to do. We stayed like that for a while. The shop was quiet. The clocks on the wall moved through their sequences, the pendulums swinging the escapements, releasing one tooth at a time. The hands turning with the patient indifference of things that measure time without caring what it contains. After a few minutes, Nora lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry, which did not surprise me. I had seen her cry exactly once at Claire's funeral, and she had done it the way she did most things, quietly, completely, and without asking anyone to notice. I kept thinking, she said, that if I did everything right, it would feel like something. I did not ask her what she meant. I understood what she meant. Does it? I asked. She looked at the carriage clock in the front of the display case, the one she had spent 2 months restoring, the one with the replaced mainspring, and the clean jewels and the new crystal she had ordered from a supplier in Connecticut, because the original was cracked. It feels like finishing a repair, she said. You put it back together and it runs and you know it's right. But the clock doesn't know you fixed it. It just runs. I put my arm around her, and she leaned against my shoulder, and for a little while we sat on the floor of the shop together while the clocks kept time around us, and outside the last morning of December moved quietly toward afternoon. Rex found us there when he came back at 9. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, and then he stepped inside and sat down on the floor on Nora's other side without saying a word. He was 65 years old, and it clearly took some effort, but he did it without complaint. The three of us sat against the display case, while the morning light shifted and the clocks ticked on, and nobody felt the need to say anything at all for quite some time. January came in quietly, the way things do after a long noise stops. The shop reopened on the 2nd. I serviced a carriage clock for a woman who had inherited it from her mother, replaced a broken mainspring in a pocket watch a man had carried for 30 years, and ordered 3 sets of replacement jewels from a supplier in Vermont. The work was the same work it had always been, and I was grateful for that in a way I had not been before. The way you become grateful for the ordinary texture of a day after a period when ordinary days are not available. Thomas Bale called on January 8th. The federal grand jury had returned the indictment the previous afternoon. Dennis faced 6 counts in total, 2 counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 13431, 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud, 1 count of obstruction of justice related to the guardianship proceeding, and 2 counts under Oregon law, 2nd-degree burglary for the shop break-in and 1st-degree forgery for the backdated document. The homicide charge, Thomas explained, was being handled separately by the Oregon State Prosecutor's Office in coordination with the FBI, and would be filed as a distinct indictment once the forensic evidence had cleared the remaining verification steps. The expected timeline for that filing was late February or early March. Dennis remained in federal custody. His bail application had been denied on the grounds that he posed a flight risk, given the loan default, the frozen assets, and the federal investigation. Thomas said this was not unusual in cases involving multiple jurisdictions and a pending homicide charge. I told Nora at dinner. She was eating soup she had made herself. She had started cooking more in January, which I took as a sign of something settling, and she listened carefully and asked one question: whether the homicide indictment timeline would affect the civil debt proceedings. Thomas had already anticipated this. The asset freeze remained in place regardless of the criminal timeline, and the civil judgment process would proceed on its own track. I relayed this, and she nodded and finished her soup. Rex stopped by on January 14th with news about Sylvia Marsh and Victor Hale. The Oregon State Bar had opened a formal disciplinary investigation into Sylvia's conduct in connection with the guardianship petition and the document fraud. Her law license had been placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome, which meant she could not practice law in Oregon or any reciprocal jurisdiction while the investigation was active. Rex said she had continued cooperating with the FBI and that her cooperation was being considered in the assessment of any charges against her personally, though no decision had been made yet. Victor Hale had been charged in federal court with stalking under 18 U.S.C. Section 2261A and conspiracy to intimidate a witness under 18 U.S.C. Section 1512. He had retained a public defender and entered a not guilty plea. Rex said the evidence against him, the surveillance log, the documented proximity to the shop on 11 occasions, his employment history with the lending firm, and a series of phone records connecting him to Dennis during the surveillance period, was, in Rex's words, not favorable to the defense. Through all of this, Nora went back to school. She had missed the last 2 weeks of the fall semester due to what we told the school was a family health matter, which was accurate in the ways that mattered. In January, she returned to her regular schedule: 3 advanced courses, an independent study in mechanical engineering she had arranged with a professor at the community college, and a Tuesday afternoon shift at the shop that she had maintained without interruption since she was 12. Her teachers noted in the mid-year review that arrived in late January that her work was excellent, and that she seemed, in the words of her English teacher, unusually self-possessed for her age. I read that phrase several times. I was not sure it captured what I knew of her, but I understood what the teacher meant by it, and I did not disagree. One afternoon in late January, I found her in the back of the shop, not working, just sitting on the stool by the window that looked out at the alley and the narrow strip of gray sky above the neighboring building. She had her gear sketchbook open on her lap, but she was not writing in it. She was watching a bird, a small brown sparrow that had landed on the window ledge and was sitting there with the dense, compact stillness of small birds in cold weather. I asked if she was all right. She watched the sparrow for another moment before answering. "I've been thinking about Mom," she said. "Not about what happened. Just about her." The way she laughed at things she found funny before anyone else in the room realized they were funny. She paused. "I haven't let myself think about that in a long time." The sparrow flew away. Nora looked down at the sketchbook and made a small drawing in the margin, not a gear, just a bird, 4 quick lines, and then turned the page. "I think I'm going to be all right," she said. It came out as an observation rather than a reassurance, the way she stated things she had verified and found to be true. "I know you are," I said. She looked up at me with the expression she wore when she was checking a measurement for the second time, not because she doubted the first result, but because precision was a habit she had decided was worth keeping. Rex came by on the last Friday of January with a bottle of decent Oregon Pinot and 3 glasses, and we sat in the back room after closing, I at the bench, Nora on the stool by the window, Rex in the chair he had claimed as his own sometime in November, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Rex told a story about a case he had worked in 1987 involving a stolen horse and a misidentified set of tire tracks that had somehow resulted in the arrest of the wrong man and the accidental recovery of a separate crime. Nora laughed at the right moments and asked follow-up questions and drank half a glass of cider I had found in the back of the refrigerator, and I sat at the bench and listened and thought about the word ordinary and how it was when you had been without it for a while. One of the finest words in the language. In early February, Thomas called again. The civil asset liquidation had begun. Dennis's 2 bank accounts had been assessed. Combined, they held enough to cover approximately 40% of the judgment. The leased vehicle would be returned to the lessor. The partial interest in the Portland commercial property was being appraised. Thomas estimated the full recovery would take 4 to 6 months, with some portion of the judgment likely remaining unsatisfied, given the gap between Dennis's available assets and the $2.3 million claim. He said Nora should not expect full recovery, but that the legal priority structure of the trust meant the patent proceeds themselves were entirely protected regardless of the civil outcome. Nora, when I told her, said that she had not expected full recovery. She said she had bought the debt at 60 cents on the dollar because she wanted the legal mechanism, not the money. Thomas, when I relayed this to him, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell her she should consider law school," I told her. She considered it for approximately 2 seconds and said she was going to be a mechanical engineer, but that she appreciated the thought. The homicide indictment came on the 24th of February. Thomas called at noon. The Oregon State Prosecutor's Office, working in coordination with the FBI, had filed a formal indictment against Dennis Greer on 1 count of murder in the 2nd degree under ORS 163.115, charging that he had administered a controlled CNS depressant to Claire Greer in the 36 to 48 hours preceding her fatal accident in December of 2023, with the intent to cause serious physical injury or death. The forensic evidence, the certified toxicology analysis, the second blood work panel obtained under federal warrant, the timeline reconstructed from Claire's phone records, and Dennis's movements had been sufficient to bring the charge. A second count of conspiracy to commit murder was filed jointly against Dennis and Victor Hale. The charge on the arrest warrant back in December had listed homicide by abuse, a preliminary classification used when the full forensic picture had not yet been certified. The grand jury, working from the completed toxicology record and the reconstructed timeline, returned the more specific charge of murder in the second degree, based on the phone records connecting them during the period of the poisoning. I was standing at the workbench when Thomas told me this. I had a movement in my hands, a simple time-only pocket watch, nothing complicated, and I set it down carefully on the cloth before I said anything. I asked Thomas what happened next. He said the criminal trial would be scheduled for later in the year, likely autumn, given the complexity of the evidence and the coordination between state and federal jurisdictions. He said the civil proceedings were continuing on their separate track. He said that whatever happened at trial, the indictment itself was now part of the public record, and that Claire Greer's name was in that record not as a footnote, but as the reason the case existed at all. I thanked him. I hung up. I stood at the bench for a long time. Nora was at school. I knew her schedule well enough to know she was in her independent mechanical engineering study, at that hour sitting across from a community college professor twice her age, discussing something precise and solvable. I decided not to call her. Some news is better delivered in person at a kitchen table with enough time afterward to sit with it properly. She came home at 3:30. I had made coffee and set out 2 cups, which by now she understood as a signal that something had happened. She sat down across from me and I told her about the indictment, the charge, the second count against Victor Hale, the trial timeline, what Thomas had said about Claire's name being in the public record. She listened without moving. When I finished, she looked at her coffee cup for a moment, then looked up. "Second degree," she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was accepting a measurement she had not quite expected. "That means they believe it was intentional, but may not have sufficient evidence to prove premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt," she said. "First degree would require proving he planned it in advance." "Haktuntinde." Thomas said the same thing I said. He said the evidence strongly supports intent. Whether it rises to premeditation will be for the jury. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February afternoon was doing what February afternoons in Oregon did, shifting between gray and grayer, the light coming off the water with a flat, patient quality that I had lived alongside for 40 years and still found on certain days genuinely beautiful. "She called me that morning," Nora said. Not for the first time, she had told me this weeks ago at the kitchen table with Rex on the evening everything about Victor Hale had come clear. But this time she said it differently, without the careful flatness she used when she was reporting facts. This time it sounded like what it was. She called to tell me she was going to see a lawyer that afternoon, that she had finally found what she needed. Nora stopped. She looked at the table. She didn't sound frightened. She sounded settled, like someone who had made a decision and wasn't going back on it. A pause. She always got quiet like that when she knew exactly what she was going to do. A pause. She always had a plan. I did not say anything. Some things do not need a response. They need only to be said and heard. After a while, Nora straightened and picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, the way she did when she was thinking through something carefully. "Will you be all right?" she asked. Through the trial, the question surprised me, which it should not have. She had been asking the right questions since she was 12 years old. "Yes," I said. "Will you?" "Yes," she said. Then after a moment, "I think Mom would have liked knowing it went this far. That someone kept going." I thought about that. I thought about Claire at 7 years old sitting on the floor of the shop while I explained to her the difference between a mainspring and a hairspring, and her asking with the concentrated seriousness of a child who has decided something is important, whether the spring knew it was the most important part. I had told her that the spring did not know anything, that it simply did what it was built to do. She had thought about this and said that was probably enough. I went to the shelf above the workbench and picked up the minute repeater. I brought it to the table and set it in front of Nora. She looked at it. "We already finished this one." "I know," I said. "I want you to have it." She picked it up with both hands, the careful, complete grip she used for mechanisms she intended to understand fully. She turned it over and examined the case, the crown, the repeating slide. Then she pressed the slide and held the watch between us, and we listened to it chime together 3 hours, 2 quarters, 7 minutes, the small hammer train moving through its sequence with the same unhurried precision it had demonstrated on the workbench at Christmas, indifferent to how much had happened since. "Why this one?" she asked. "Because of what it does," I said. "It keeps time like any other watch, but it also remembers. You press the slide and it tells you exactly where you are, the hour, the quarter, the minute. It doesn't guess. It doesn't approximate." I looked at her. "You've always known exactly where you are." She held the watch for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket, the left one close to her side, and picked up her coffee cup again. Rex came by that evening as he usually did when something significant had occurred, and we told him about the indictment, and he sat with it in the way he sat with things, quietly and without rushing to fill the silence. At some point he looked at Nora and asked her what she was going to do with the rest of the week. She considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Finish the carriage clock," she said. "Write a paper on detent escapements for the independent study. Cook something complicated on Saturday." A pause. "And think about Claire." Rex nodded. "Good plan," he said. Later, after Rex had gone and Nora had gone to bed, I sat alone at the workbench for a while. The shop was quiet. The clocks on the wall marked the hour in their various voices, the deep note of the regulator, the lighter chime of the bracket clock, the small, steady tick of the carriage clock Nora had restored, and that I had placed in the front case, because it deserved to be seen. Outside, the Oregon night came in off the water cold and very dark, and the street was empty, and the light above the workbench made a warm circle that reached to the edges of the bench and no further. I thought about the things that had happened in this shop over the past 4 months. The envelope from New York, the phone in its box, the camera behind the pendulum bracket. The night the security footage showed 2 people moving through the dark with a brass key. The morning in the courthouse corridor when Nora had straightened my tie without being asked. The floor on the last day of December and the 3 of us sitting against the display case while the clocks kept time. I thought about Claire the way Nora had asked me to, not about what happened, but about her. The way she laughed before anyone else realized something was funny. The way she had sat on this same floor as a child and asked whether a spring knew it was important. I picked up the simple pocket watch I had set down that afternoon when Thomas called. I finished the movement, closed the case, wound it, and set it running. It was a plain watch, no repeater, no complications, just the clean tick of a well-made machine doing what it was built to do. I set it on the shelf and turned off the bench lamp. That was as best as I can say where it ended. Not with a verdict that would come later in a courtroom I would sit in, and Nora would sit in, and we would hear together what 12 people decided about the weight of what Dennis had done. Not with a resolution that tied everything neatly closed, but with a watch running on a shelf in a quiet shop, and a 15-year-old girl asleep upstairs, with a minute repeater in the pocket of her coat, and the particular stillness of a night in which the dangerous thing was over, and the rest of it, the long, ordinary, unscheduled rest of it, was still waiting to be lived. That, I think, is enough. I am 70 years old. I have stayed silent too long, chosen comfort over truth too many times. If these grandpa stories teach anything, do not wait the way I waited. Do not let silence become a decision you never meant to make. I believe God places certain people in our lives not to protect us from pain, but to show us what courage actually looks like up close. Nora showed me that. Claire deserved better from me, and I carry that. Every family story has a version of Dennis in it, somewhere someone who mistakes love for ownership and money for power. My personal belief is simple: no inheritance, no patent, no sum of money is worth what we lose when we stop protecting each other. These grandpa stories are not comfortable, but they are honest, and every honest family story is worth more than a perfect one. If something here stayed with you, leave a comment. I read everyone. Share this with someone who needs it. And if you want to stay for more grandpa stories, you are always welcome here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for honest human purposes. If that is not for you, no obligation. But if you are still here, welcome back.